When millionaire James stumbles upon a young black boy named Elijah sleeping alone in the park night after night, he's disturbed. But as he digs deeper, the truth behind the boy's solitude reveals a heartbreaking secret that brings him to tears. What dark reality could force a child into such desperate isolation? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. James Prescott straightened his Italian silk tie as the last investors filed out of the conference room. The downtown skyline gleamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the setting sun casting long shadows across his polished mahogany desk. Another successful meeting, another multi-million-dollar deal closed. Just business as usual. "Mr. Prescott, is there anything else you need?" His assistant, Minda, hovered at the doorway with her tablet clutched to her chest. "No, that'll be all." His voice was clipped, efficient. He didn't look up as he gathered his papers into his leather briefcase. Sarah's quiet footsteps retreated, leaving him alone in the silence of his corner office. James checked his Rolex, 7:45 p.m. The cleaning crew was already making their rounds, the gentle hum of vacuum cleaners in the distance. He should have felt satisfied with today's victory, but the familiar emptiness crept in instead. 20 years of building his real estate empire, and sometimes it felt like nothing more than a stack of blueprints and balance sheets. The elevator ride down was solitary, just how he preferred it. In the lobby, the security guard nodded respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Prescott." Outside, the spring evening was unexpectedly mild. Instead of calling his driver, James felt an unusual urge to walk. The city park was only a few blocks away, a shortcut he never took, always too busy, always rushing to the next meeting. His expensive shoes clicked against the concrete as he turned onto the tree-lined path. The park was quiet at this hour, with only a few joggers and dog walkers passing by. Oak trees towered overhead, their new leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was peaceful. When was the last time he'd actually noticed something as simple as trees? A child's laughter echoed from a nearby playground, and James found himself slowing down. A young father was pushing his daughter on the swings, their shared joy evident in their smiles. Something tightened in James's chest, an old familiar ache he usually buried under spreadsheets and projections. He quickened his pace, his grip tightening on his briefcase. The park's winding path led him past a small pond where ducks paddled lazily in the fading light. A wooden bench sat empty nearby, and for a moment James considered sitting down. Just for a minute, just to breathe. But old habits died hard. Time was money, and James Prescott hadn't built his fortune by watching ducks and sitting on park benches. He checked his watch again, calculating the time lost by taking this detour. Still, as he emerged from the other side of the park, something had shifted ever so slightly. The weight of his briefcase felt heavier, his collar a bit tighter. The city's usual bustle surrounded him once more, but the peaceful moment in the park lingered like a crack in his carefully constructed armor. He pulled out his phone, scanning through emails as he walked, trying to drown out the sound of that child's laughter still echoing in his mind. There were contracts to review, meetings to prepare for, deals to close. That's what mattered. That's what had always mattered. But for the first time in years, James Prescott wasn't entirely convinced. As James walked deeper into the park, a small plaque on a stone pillar caught his eye. Prescott Memorial Park, funded by Prescott Developments. He barely remembered the ribbon-cutting ceremony from 3 years ago. Just another tax write-off, another piece of good PR for his company. The evening had settled in fully now, with street lamps casting pools of warm light along the winding paths. The park was almost empty, save for a few late-night joggers. The quiet was different at this hour, more contemplative, more profound. Something unusual caught his attention near one of the benches. A small figure was huddled underneath, partially hidden by shadows. James's first instinct was to walk past, but a dim light from a phone screen illuminated what appeared to be a child's face. James stopped, his business instincts warring with an unfamiliar sense of concern. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, curled up with what looked like a battered book propped against his knees. Under the glow of the street lamp, James could make out technical diagrams on the worn pages. "What are you doing out here?" James asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. The boy startled, nearly dropping his book. Large, intelligent eyes looked up at James, wary but not afraid. "Reading about mechanical engineering," he answered simply, holding up the tattered book. "It was my dad's." Something in the boy's calm demeanor made James pause. "Where are your parents? It's not safe to be out here alone at this hour." "I'm waiting for my dad," the boy said, his voice smaller now. "He works nearby. I'm Elijah." James frowned, checking his watch. "At this hour?" Elijah's fingers tightened around the book. He usually meets me here. I've been waiting for almost a week now." His voice wavered slightly. "I can't find him anywhere, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the cool night air. James noticed the boy's wrinkled clothes, the small backpack tucked behind him. How long had he been sleeping here? "A week?" James repeated, his usual detachment cracking slightly. "You've been sleeping in this park for a week?" Elijah nodded, his chin lifting with a hint of pride. "I'm okay, though. I have my dad's book and—" He hesitated. "He has to come back eventually. This is where we always meet." James stood there, his briefcase suddenly feeling like a trivial weight in his hand. The boy's eyes returned to his book, as if dismissing James's presence, but there was something in the way his shoulders hunched that spoke of exhaustion and fear carefully hidden. For the first time in years, James Prescott found himself completely at a loss for words. "What's your father's name?" James asked, his throat suddenly feeling tight. "Alfredo Sampson," Elijah replied proudly. "He's the best construction worker ever. He knows everything about building things." The name hit James like a physical blow. His legs weakened, and he had to steady himself against the bench. Alfredo Sampson, the accident at Site B last week. The images flooded back, the collapse, the ambulances, the paperwork. "He always tells me to study while I wait," Elijah continued, unaware of James's reaction. "See this part here?" He pointed to a diagram in the book. "It's about load-bearing structures. Dad explained how important it is to understand the foundation of buildings. He says if I learn all this, I could be an engineer someday, just like I want to." James's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. This boy had been waiting here for a week, not knowing his father would never return. The weight of it crushed his chest, making it hard to breathe. "And look at this." Elijah's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages. "These are cantilever designs. Dad taught me all about them. He said they're like arms reaching out from a building, but you have to calculate the weight distribution just right." His small fingers traced the diagrams with familiarity. "I've been practicing the math while I wait. Dad will be so proud when he sees how much I've learned." The tears rolled down James's cheeks now, unchecked. Here was this child, alone in the world, still believing his father would return, still following his instructions to study, still holding on to hope. The pure innocence of it broke something inside James's carefully constructed walls. "Did you know my dad?" Elijah asked, finally noticing James's distress. "He's really smart. Everyone at work respects him. He always says that knowledge is the best tool we can have." The boy's face beamed with pride as he spoke about his father. James found himself sliding down to sit on the ground next to the bench, his expensive suit collecting dirt. He couldn't bring himself to care. The determination in Elijah's voice, the way he spoke about engineering with such passion and understanding, it was a testament to Alfredo's dedication as a father. "You," James's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You really know your stuff about engineering." Elijah smiled, a bright, genuine expression that made James's heart ache even more. "Dad says I'm a natural. He says I got my mom's brains and his curiosity." He hugged the book to his chest. "I'm going to make him so proud when he comes back." James sat there, tears streaming down his face, as Elijah continued to explain complex engineering concepts with childlike enthusiasm. The boy's knowledge was indeed impressive, But it was his unwavering faith in his father's return that truly showcased his remarkable spirit. James wiped his eyes with trembling hands, his expensive silk handkerchief soaked with tears. The reality of the situation, this bright, hopeful boy waiting endlessly for a father who would never return, was overwhelming. He looked at Elijah, still enthusiastically pointing out diagrams in his worn engineering book, and felt a crushing weight settle in his chest. "It's getting late," James said softly, his voice hoarse from crying, "and it's not safe for you to be out here alone at night." Elijah glanced up at the darkening sky. "But Dad might come soon. He always tells me to wait right here." James's heart clenched painfully. "How about—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "How about you come stay at my house tonight? It's warm there, and you can have a proper dinner. We can come back tomorrow to wait for your dad." The boy hesitated, clutching his book tighter. "I don't know. Dad always says not to go with strangers." "Your father is right about that," James agreed, his voice breaking slightly. "But I'm James Prescott. I work with your father at the construction company." The words felt like acid in his mouth, knowing he was the owner who had failed to prevent Alfredo's accident. Elijah's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, Dad mentioned you before. He said you built this whole park." James nodded, fighting back fresh tears. "That's right. And I promise you'll be safe with me. We can have some hot chocolate, and maybe you can tell me more about what you're learning." After a moment's consideration, Elijah carefully packed his book into his worn backpack. "Okay, Mr. Prescott, but we have to come back first thing tomorrow. I don't want Dad to worry if he comes and I'm not here." James stood up, his legs still shaky, and held out his hand. Elijah took it, his small fingers trusting and warm. As they walked to James's car, the boy chatted about structural engineering principles, his innocent enthusiasm a stark contrast to the turmoil in James's heart. Opening the door to his luxury vehicle, James helped Elijah inside. The boy's eyes grew wide at the leather interior and sophisticated dashboard. As James settled into the driver's seat, he glanced at Elijah in the rearview mirror, seeing him trace the stitching on the leather seat with wonder. The truth about Alfredo sat heavy in James's throat, threatening to choke him. But he couldn't bring himself to shatter this child's world. Not yet, not tonight. Instead, he focused on getting Elijah somewhere safe and warm, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges. As they drove through the city streets, James listened to Elijah's continued explanations about engineering concepts, each word a reminder of the father who had invested so much time in nurturing his son's dreams. Tears threatened to spill again, but James blinked them back, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The next morning, James sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of construction site reports and safety documents. He had barely slept, spending most of the night checking on Elijah, who was sleeping peacefully in one of his guest rooms. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. With trembling hands, James opened the accident report from that fatal day. His eyes scanned the details he had previously glossed over, too caught up in keeping the project moving forward to properly process the tragedy. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, pulling out his phone to call his site manager, Tom. "Mr. Prescott?" Tom answered on the second ring. "The safety harness Alfredo was wearing. I need to know everything about its inspection history." James's voice was tight with barely contained emotion. There was a long pause on the other end. "Sir, I'll have to check the records." "Do it now, and send me everything. Maintenance logs, purchase orders, inspection certificates." James ran his hand through his disheveled hair. "I want it all within the hour." While waiting, James pulled up the security footage from that day. He hadn't watched it before, leaving it to his safety team to handle the investigation. Now, frame by frame, he forced himself to observe Alfredo's last moments. The harness had snapped clean through, something that should have been impossible with properly maintained equipment. His computer pinged with an incoming email from Tom. James's eyes widened as he read through the documents. The safety equipment had been due for replacement 3 months before the accident. The requisition order had been filed, but someone had delayed it to cut costs. James's hands clenched into fists. He remembered signing off on a budget reduction plan, trusting his managers to make appropriate cuts. He had been so focused on profits, on impressing his investors, that he had failed to verify where those cuts were coming from. A soft knock at his office door startled him. "Mr. Prescott?" Elijah's small voice called out. "Your housekeeper said breakfast is ready." "I'll be right there," James called back, quickly minimizing the screens on his computer. He couldn't let Elijah see any of this, not until he had the full picture, not until he could explain how thoroughly he had failed the boy's father. As he stood up from his desk, James made a silent promise. He would get to the bottom of this, hold the right people accountable, including himself, and make sure nothing like this ever happened again. He owed that much to Alfredo and to the bright-eyed boy waiting for him at the breakfast table. In James's spacious mansion, Elijah sat on the edge of his temporary bed, running his small hands over the softest sheets he had ever felt. The guest room was bigger than his old apartment's living room, with warm beige walls and large windows that let in streams of morning sunlight. His father's engineering book lay carefully placed on the bedside table, its worn edges a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar place. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had brought him fresh clothes that morning, new jeans, t-shirts, and even a warm sweater. Everything fit perfectly, making Elijah wonder how they knew his size. He changed quickly, still amazed at how different he felt in clean, new clothes. "Would you like some breakfast, dear?" Mrs. Chen's kind voice called from the doorway. Her gentle smile reminded him of his mother's, from the fading memories he still held close. "Yes, please," Elijah replied politely, following her down the grand staircase to the kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed, and the smell of pancakes filled the air. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast: golden pancakes, crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit arranged beautifully on a plate. "Eat as much as you'd like," she encouraged, placing a glass of cold milk beside his plate. "You need to get your strength back." Elijah hadn't realized how hungry he was until he took his first bite. He'd been surviving on whatever he could find or buy with the little money he had left, trying to stretch it out while waiting for his father at the park each day. After breakfast, Mrs. Chen showed him around the house. There was a game room with a huge TV and video games he'd only seen in store windows. The library was filled with books, including an entire shelf of engineering texts that made his eyes light up. In the backyard, a swimming pool sparkled in the sunlight. "Mr. Prescott said you can use anything you'd like," Mrs. Chen explained, watching as Elijah explored with wide-eyed wonder. "He also arranged for a tutor to come tomorrow to help you keep up with your studies." Later that afternoon, Elijah curled up in a plush armchair in the library, surrounded by engineering books. He'd found one about bridges, his father's specialty, and lost himself in the familiar diagrams and equations. For the first time in days, he felt safe and warm, his body and mind finally able to rest. Mrs. Chen brought him snacks throughout the day, making sure he stayed comfortable and well-fed. She helped him organize his new clothes in the dresser and showed him how to use the tablet James had left for him, already loaded with educational apps and games. As evening approached, Elijah sat at his new desk, carefully copying equations from one of the engineering books. The lamp cast a warm glow over his work, so different from the harsh streetlight he'd been reading under just days before. Though his heart still ached for his father, the kindness he'd found in this house gave him a moment of peace he desperately needed. That evening, James stood in the hallway outside Elijah's room, his hand hesitating at the door. The weight of what he needed to tell the boy pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Instead, he knocked softly. "Come in," Elijah's small voice called out. James entered to find Elijah sitting cross-legged on the bed, surrounded by engineering books from the library. The sight made his chest tighten. "How are you settling in?" James asked, his usually commanding voice gentler now. "Is everything comfortable for you?" Elijah nodded, carefully closing the book in his lap. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Chen has been really nice, and the room is amazing." He glanced around, still seeming somewhat overwhelmed by the luxury. "Please call me James." He sat down in the armchair near the bed. Is there anything you need? Anything you'd like to do? Elijah hesitated, then spoke softly. I just wish I knew when my dad was coming back. He's probably worried about me. James felt the words like a physical blow. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. Can you tell me more about your family, Elijah? The boy's eyes grew distant, focusing on something beyond the room's walls. It's just been me and Dad for as long as I can remember. Mom died when I was born. He picked at the edge of his blanket. Dad says she was beautiful and smart and that she loved me even before she met me. James listened, his heart growing heavier with each word. Dad works really hard, Elijah continued, pride evident in his voice. He always says that everything he does is for me. We don't have any other family. Dad's parents died before I was born, and Mom was an only child whose parents had already passed away too. James watched as Elijah reached for the engineering book beside him, running his fingers along its spine. Dad takes extra shifts whenever he can. He wants me to go to college someday, to become an engineer like he always dreamed of being. The revelation that Elijah had absolutely no one else in the world hit James like a thunderbolt. This child, this brilliant, resilient boy, would be completely alone, if not for him. The responsibility of this knowledge settled deep in his bones, transforming his guilt into something else, a fierce determination to protect and care for Elijah. You really love engineering, don't you? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Yes, Elijah smiled, his face lighting up. Dad says I get it from Mom. She was really good at math and science, too. James nodded, unable to trust his voice for a moment. Here was a child who had already lost so much, yet still maintained such hope and passion. The weight of what he would eventually have to tell Elijah felt even heavier now. The next morning, James sat in his office, his fingers drumming against his mahogany desk. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he had been there for hours already, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He pressed the intercom button. Clara, could you come in here, please? Moments later, his assistant of 7 years entered, notepad ready as always. Clara was efficient and unflappable, qualities that had made her invaluable to James over the years. I need you to look into something different today, James said, his voice firm but uncertain in a way Clara had never heard before. I need information about the foster care system, and I want to know what legal options exist for becoming a guardian. Clara's pen, which had been poised to take notes, froze midair. She looked up at her boss, her professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal genuine surprise. I'm sorry, Mr. Prescott. Did you say guardian? James stood up and walked to the window, his reflection showing the internal struggle playing across his features. It's about the boy, Elijah. He has no living relatives, Clara. None. If I don't do something, he'll end up in the system. Clara carefully set her notepad down. In 7 years, she had never seen James Prescott, the man known for his ruthless business decisions, show such concern for anyone. Sir, this is unexpected. Are you sure about this? Taking responsibility for a child is very different from running a company. I'm aware, James replied, turning back to face her. His voice carried a hint of defensive irritation. But I'm also aware that I'm partially responsible for his current situation. I can't just... He stopped, collecting himself. I won't let him become another statistic. Clara studied her boss carefully. The man standing before her was markedly different from the cold, calculating executive she was used to. There was something softer in his eyes, something she had never seen before. I'll need you to be discreet about this, James continued. Contact our legal team, but keep it confidential for now. I want to know every option available, every requirement, every potential obstacle. Of course, sir. Clara made some quick notes. But may I speak freely? James nodded, bracing himself. This isn't like you, she said carefully. In all the years I've worked here, I've never seen you take a personal interest in anyone's welfare, let alone consider something like this. Are you certain this isn't just guilt talking? James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Maybe it started as guilt, Clara. But that boy, he's special, brilliant, and he deserves better than being lost in some system that might crush that spirit of his. Clara nodded slowly, making more notes. Despite her surprise, she could see the determination in her boss's eyes, a look she recognized from when he was dead set on closing a major deal. But this time, it wasn't about property or profits. It was about a child's future. "I'll have preliminary information for you by this afternoon," she said, standing up. "And sir, this is a good thing you're doing." A week later, James sat across from his lawyer in the study while Elijah played in the garden outside. Through the window, he could see the boy examining the flowers with the same careful attention he gave to his engineering books. "The temporary guardianship papers have been filed," the lawyer explained, sliding the documents across the desk. "Given your resources and Elijah's situation, the judge was sympathetic. You'll have temporary custody while we proceed with the permanent arrangement." James nodded, his eyes still on Elijah. "Thank you, Richard. Make sure everything is done properly." After the lawyer left, James joined Elijah in the garden. The boy was crouched near a cluster of daisies, his father's old engineering book tucked under his arm as always. "These flowers grow in patterns," Elijah said without looking up. "Dad used to say nature was the best engineer." James settled onto a nearby garden bench. "Your father sounds like a wise man. Would you tell me more about him?" Elijah's face lit up as he joined James on the bench. "Dad was the best. He worked really hard, but he always made time to teach me things." He opened the worn book carefully, revealing notes scribbled in the margins. "See these? Dad wrote them for me. He said that one day I'd understand them all." James leaned closer, noting the careful handwriting and detailed explanations. "He wanted to make sure you had everything you needed to learn." "Yeah," Elijah smiled, tracing his finger along one of the notes. "Sometimes, when he worked late, he'd bring me to the construction site during his break. We'd sit and eat sandwiches, and he'd point at the buildings explaining how they stayed up." His voice grew softer. "He said that one day we'd build something together." James felt his throat tighten. He wanted great things for you, didn't he? "He said we had to work extra hard because it was just us two," Elijah continued, turning another page. "But he never complained. Even when he was tired, he'd help me with math problems or read to me from this book." He paused, his small fingers running over a coffee stain on one page. "This mark is from when he fell asleep while reading to me. He worked so many hours that day, but he still wanted to teach me." James watched as Elijah carefully closed the book, holding it close to his chest. "Dad always said that education was the best gift he could give me. He saved every extra penny for my college fund." The boy's voice wavered slightly. "He wanted me to become an engineer, just like I wanted." Silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the garden. James found himself reaching out, placing a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. The boy didn't pull away. "Your father gave you something very precious," James said softly. "He gave you dreams and the tools to achieve them." Elijah nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I miss him telling me stories about his work. He made everything sound so interesting, even the boring parts." The next morning, James found himself distracted during his usual business calls. His mind kept drifting to the engineering book that meant so much to Elijah. During a break between meetings, he pulled out his tablet and began researching beginner engineering concepts. That evening, he discovered Elijah at the dining room table, surrounded by paper covered in careful drawings of buildings and bridges. The sight stopped James in his tracks. He recognized that same intense focus, the same drive he'd had at that age when he'd sketch out his first real estate developments. "What are you working on?" James asked, pulling up a chair beside the boy. Elijah looked up, slightly startled. "I'm trying to understand what Dad wrote about load-bearing walls, but some of the words are too big." James glanced at the notes, remembering his own early struggles with technical terms. "You know, I studied some engineering before I went into business. Would you like me to help explain it?" The boy's eyes lit up. "Really? You know about this stuff too?" "I do." James pulled one of the drawings closer. "In fact, this reminds me of my first attempts at designing buildings, though yours are much neater than mine were." For the next hour, James found himself explaining basic structural concepts, using simple analogies that Elijah could understand. He showed the boy how to demonstrate load distribution using pencils and erasers, creating small structures on the table. "See how the weight travels down?" James demonstrated, carefully placing another pencil. "Just like your father's notes say here." Elijah's face broke into a wide smile. "That's what Dad meant. He tried to show me with his lunchboxes, but I didn't get it then." Something warm stirred in James's chest as he watched Elijah quickly sketch the concept they'd just discussed. The boy's dedication, his eager determination to understand, reminded James of himself at that age, before money and success had become his only focus. "You know," James said softly, "I used to spend hours like this trying to figure out how buildings worked. My teachers thought I was just doodling, but I was dreaming of creating something important." "Did you build something important?" Elijah asked, looking up from his drawing. James paused, thinking about all his successful projects. For the first time, they felt hollow compared to this simple moment of teaching. "I built many things, but I think helping someone else learn might be more important." Elijah beamed at him, and James saw something he recognized. That same spark of passion, that drive to understand and create. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self, before he'd lost sight of what really mattered. "Could we do this again tomorrow?" Elijah asked hopefully. "There's this other thing in Dad's notes about arches that I don't understand yet." "We can do this every day if you'd like," James found himself saying, surprised by how much he meant it. "We could even start a proper study schedule, just like real engineering students have." While Elijah slept, James sat in his home office, poring over construction site reports from the day of the accident. The dim desk lamp cast shadows across stacks of safety documents and inspection records. His eyes burned from hours of reading, but he couldn't stop. He owed it to Alfredo, to Elijah, to uncover the truth. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, comparing two inspection reports. The scaffolding that had collapsed had been certified safe just days before the incident. James made notes, circling discrepancies in dates and signatures. Something wasn't right. The next afternoon, James cleared his schedule to work with Elijah on their bridge project. They spread materials across the dining room table: popsicle sticks, glue, string, and cardboard. James watched as Elijah carefully measured each piece with a ruler. "Your dad would be proud of how precise you are," James said softly, helping Elijah align two support beams. "That's exactly what good engineers do." "Dad always said measure twice, cut once," Elijah replied, his small hand steady as he worked. "He showed me how to check everything carefully." James felt a pang in his chest. Alfredo's dedication to safety made the accident reports even more troubling. But watching Elijah work brought a different kind of feeling, pride mixed with growing affection. They worked together, James explaining the principles of tension and compression as they added each layer to their bridge. He used simple words, drawing diagrams when needed, just as Alfredo had done in his notes to Elijah. "See how these triangles make the bridge stronger?" James demonstrated by pressing gently on different sections. Each piece works together, supporting the others. Elijah's eyes sparkled with understanding. "Like a team." "Exactly like a team," James agreed, surprised by how natural it felt to teach. This wasn't about guilt anymore. He genuinely wanted to nurture Elijah's passion for engineering. As their bridge took shape, James noticed how Elijah incorporated elements from his father's notebook. The boy added small details that mimicked Alfredo's sketches, making the project a loving tribute to his father's memory. "Dad would have loved building this with us," Elijah said quietly, adding the final support beam. James placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "He's here in every careful measurement you make, in every principle you understand. We're building on the foundation he gave you." The bridge stood completed between them, small but sturdy, a physical representation of the bond they were forming. James no longer felt driven solely by responsibility or guilt. Instead, he found himself genuinely looking forward to their building sessions, to watching Elijah grow and learn. That evening, as James updated his investigation notes, he realized his mission had evolved. Finding the truth about the accident was still crucial, but ensuring Elijah's future had become equally important. He wasn't just seeking justice anymore. He was building a bridge to tomorrow, one careful piece at a time. After a few days, James strode into the boardroom, his usual power suit replaced by a more approachable navy blazer. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs as he spread out new safety protocol documents across the polished mahogany table. "These changes are non-negotiable," James stated firmly, his voice carrying none of its former cold edge. "Every construction site will have double the safety inspectors. We're implementing daily checks instead of weekly ones." Marcus Williams, the senior board member, cleared his throat. "James, these protocols will slow down our projects significantly. The costs alone are nothing compared to a human life," James cut in, thinking of Elijah's bright eyes and Alfredo's dedication. "We're also allocating 30% of our annual profits to community development projects." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Patricia Wells, head of finance, spoke up sharply. "That's unprecedented. Our shareholders will understand that we're creating sustainable growth," James explained, pulling up slides showing community impact studies. Parks, affordable housing, educational centers. These aren't just good deeds, they're investments in our future workforce. Several board members exchanged worried glances. James noticed their discomfort but pressed on, describing his vision for company-sponsored trade schools and apprenticeship programs. "This isn't the Prescott construction we know," Robert Turner, another longtime board member, objected. "We've always focused on profit maximization." "And that mindset cost a man his life," James said quietly, his voice heavy with conviction. "It left an 8-year-old boy without a father. I won't let that happen again." The tension in the room grew thick. James could see the board members' expressions hardening, their postures becoming defensive. They weren't just resistant to change, they were afraid of it. "I've already implemented these changes," James announced, standing tall. "This meeting isn't about seeking approval. It's about informing you of our new direction." Marcus leaned forward, his face flushed. "You can't make unilateral decisions like this. The board has rights." "I hold controlling interest," James reminded them calmly, "and I'm choosing to use it to build something better." As the board members filed out after the meeting, James overheard their whispered conversations, talks of proxy fights, shareholder meetings, and possible votes of no confidence. But he remained unmoved. The old James might have seen their resistance as a threat to eliminate. The new James saw it as another bridge to build, another challenge to overcome with patience and determination. At his desk later, he reviewed the new safety protocols, thinking of Elijah's careful measurements on their model bridge. Every detail mattered. Every life mattered. The board's disapproval was a small price to pay for doing what was right. Elijah continued to go to school. He adjusted his school uniform in front of the mirror while James watched from the doorway, a proud smile on his face. The past few weeks had settled into a comfortable routine: breakfast together, school drop-offs, and evening engineering lessons. At Riverside Elementary, Elijah quickly became known for his detailed technical drawings and constant questions in science class. His teachers were amazed by his understanding of structural engineering concepts far beyond what they expected from a fourth grader. When the annual Science and Engineering Fair was announced, Elijah's eyes lit up. He rushed home that day, bursting through James's office door with the permission slip clutched in his hand. "Can we enter our bridge model?" Elijah asked breathlessly. "Please, James." James's heart swelled at the boy's enthusiasm. They spent evenings refining their prototype, adding detailed architectural elements and structural improvements. Elijah's small hands worked carefully with the materials, just as his father had taught him. On the day of the competition, the school gymnasium buzzed with excitement. Their bridge model stood out among the typical volcano displays and solar system dioramas. As judges approached their table, Elijah explained the engineering principles with remarkable clarity, pointing out the load-bearing calculations and safety features they'd incorporated. "My dad taught me about tension and compression," Elijah told the impressed judges, his voice full of pride. The judges exchanged glances, moved by the interaction. When the winners were announced, Elijah's bridge project took first place. Local news reporters, attracted by the story of a young engineering prodigy, interviewed them both. "Mr. Prescott, how does it feel to mentor such a talented young engineer?" one reporter asked. James placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "It's been a privilege. Elijah's father laid the foundation. I'm just helping build on it." That evening, as they hung the blue ribbon in Elijah's room, the boy grew quiet. "Do you think my dad would be proud?" he asked softly. "More than you can imagine," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. That night, Elijah asked James, "When will he come back?" Elijah's question hung in the air, heavy with hope and innocence. "Did you find any clues today?" James knelt down to eye level with Elijah, his heart breaking all over again. "We're doing everything we can to find him," he said, the familiar lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Each day, the weight of the truth grew heavier, but James still couldn't bring himself to shatter Elijah's world. The blue ribbon caught the evening light, casting small shadows on the wall. Elijah traced the words, "first place," with his finger, lost in thought about his father, while James watched, torn between pride in their achievement and the growing burden of his silence. The next day, Clara rushed into James's office early one morning, her usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. She clutched a manila folder tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Prescott, we have a situation," she said, closing the door behind her. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across James's desk. James looked up from his computer where he'd been reviewing the new safety protocols. "What is it, Clara?" "Some of the former board members, particularly Mr. Davidson and Ms. Reynolds, Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're planning to go public with allegations about the construction site accident." James's jaw tightened. He gestured for Clara to sit down, and she placed the folder on his desk, spreading out several documents and printed emails. "They're claiming you knew about the safety violations before the accident," Clara explained, her voice steady but concerned. "They have what they say is documentation showing cost-cutting measures that led to—" She trailed off, knowing how sensitive the topic was, especially now with Elijah in the picture. James picked up one of the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "These are fabricated," he said firmly, though his voice carried a note of worry. "But they've twisted enough truth in here to make it believable." "There's more," Clara continued. "They're questioning your sudden interest in Elijah. They're spinning it as a publicity stunt to deflect from the company's safety record." James stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The construction site where Alfredo had died was visible in the distance, now transformed with new safety measures and protocols. "They're saying you're using him to rehabilitate your image," Clara added softly. "The timing of taking him in, the media attention from the science fair." James turned back, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I never authorized those cost-cutting measures," he said firmly. "And Elijah?" His voice caught. "Elijah has nothing to do with this." "I know that," Clara assured him. "But the board members who resigned after your safety overhaul, they're bitter. They're claiming their resignations weren't voluntary, that you forced them out to cover up their knowledge of systemic safety issues." James sat back down heavily in his chair, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. The weight of protecting both his company's reputation and Elijah's well-being pressed down on him like a physical force. "What's our exposure here, Clara?" he asked, his business instincts kicking in despite his emotional turmoil. Clara pulled out another document. "They're planning to leak these allegations to the Daily Business Journal next week. They've also approached several local news stations." She hesitated before adding, "The same ones that covered Elijah's science fair victory." James felt his stomach twist. The thought of Elijah seeing news reports questioning their relationship, or worse, learning about his father's death through a media scandal, was unbearable. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. James was in his kitchen making breakfast for Elijah when his phone started buzzing non-stop. The boy was still upstairs getting ready for school, humming the tune of his favorite song. The Daily Business Journal's headline blazed across James's screen. "Prescott Construction Scandal. Years of negligence led to worker's death." James's hands shook as he scrolled through the article. There were photographs of internal memos, safety reports with red flags that had supposedly been ignored, and financial documents showing suspicious patterns in the company's maintenance budgets. The former board members had done their homework, weaving truth and lies into a devastating narrative. Local news stations picked up the story within hours. James watched in horror as his face flashed across the morning news, alongside pictures of Alfredo Sampson and the construction site where he died. The reporters' voices were sharp with accusation. Sources claim Prescott knew about the dangerous conditions, but chose profit over worker safety. Social media exploded. #Prescott scandal began trending locally, then nationally. Comments flooded in, many from people who had praised James just weeks ago for his mentorship of Elijah at the science fair. "Using that poor boy as a PR shield," one comment read. "Disgusting." "Wonder if he took in his worker's son out of guilt?" asked another. The company's phone lines were overwhelmed. Protesters gathered outside the main office, holding signs with Alfredo's photo and demanding justice. Current employees looked at James differently in the hallways, their eyes full of doubt and questions. Clara arrived at James's house just before noon, her face drawn with concern. "The major contractors are starting to pull out," she reported. 3 big projects have already been suspended pending investigation. But the worst blow came when James saw Elijah's face on the news. They had dug up footage from the science fair, playing it alongside diagrams of the accident scene. The contrast was brutal. The boy's proud smile as he showed off his bridge model, cut against computer animations of how his father had died. Questions arise about James Prescott's true motives in taking in young Elijah Sampson, the reporter intoned. Was it compassion or calculation? James sat in his office watching his life's work crumble around him. The phone rang again. Another reporter, another demand for comment. He let it go to voicemail. On his desk sat the bridge model he and Elijah had built together. It seemed to mock him now, a symbol of trust that might soon be shattered. His secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Prescott, Child Protective Services is on line 1. They're requesting an immediate meeting regarding Elijah's placement in your home." James buried his face in his hands. The truth was there in the documents, not in the lies his rivals had crafted, but in the small details they'd used to make their fiction believable. He had been distant back then, focused on profits and expansion. He hadn't paid enough attention to the safety reports, hadn't listened closely enough to the workers' concerns. While he hadn't directly caused Alfredo's death, his hands weren't entirely clean either. Elijah froze on the stairs, his backpack clutched tight against his chest. The TV news anchor's voice cut through the morning quiet like a knife. "Death of Alfredo Sampson at Prescott construction sites raises serious questions about negligence." His father's name. His father's face on the screen. And there was James, looking stern and businesslike in video footage from years ago. The words cover-up and safety violations echoed in Elijah's ears as tears welled up in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elijah's voice cracked as he stepped into the kitchen. James turned, his face pale and stricken. "You knew all along?" "Elijah, please let me explain." James reached out, but Elijah backed away, bumping into the counter. "My dad," Elijah's voice trembled. "He died at your building site, and you just let me stay here without telling me?" The betrayal cut deep, turning all their shared moments into questions. The bridge model, the engineering lessons, the late-night talks about his father. Had it all been guilt? "I was trying to find the right time," James said softly, his voice heavy with regret. "I wanted to make sure I had all the facts." "Stop!" Elijah grabbed his father's old engineering book from his backpack, hugging it close. "You're just like they said on TV. You only took me in because... He couldn't finish the sentence. Without another word, Elijah ran. Past James's reaching hands, through the fancy front door, down the manicured driveway. He ran until his legs burned, until the wealthy neighborhood gave way to familiar streets, until he reached the park where James had first found him. The bench was still there, his bench where he'd spent so many evenings waiting for his father. Elijah crawled underneath it, just like before. The concrete was cold and hard, but it felt more real than the soft bed in James's guest room. He opened his father's book, fingers tracing the worn pages and familiar diagrams. Tears splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. "I miss you, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. I thought James was different. I thought he cared." The morning grew warmer, but Elijah stayed in the shadow of the bench, lost in memories of his father. Other kids passed by on their way to school, but he barely noticed them. The book in his hands was his only comfort now, the last real connection to his father that hadn't been tainted by lies. Elijah curled up tighter under the bench, his father's book pressed against his heart like a shield. The park had always been his safe place, where he'd felt closest to his father. Now it was his refuge again, but this time from the man who'd promised to protect him. The next day, James sat in his darkened office staring at the untouched coffee on his desk. The morning papers were scattered around him, their headlines screaming accusations. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from the board members and PR team, but he couldn't bring himself to answer any of them. All he could see was Elijah's face, the hurt, the betrayal, the trust shattering like glass. The boy's absence left an ache in his chest he'd never experienced before. "Sir," Clara appeared at his door. "The press is gathering downstairs. They're demanding a statement." James straightened his tie, a mechanical gesture that felt empty now. "Tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes." In the elevator, James caught his reflection in the polished doors. The successful businessman staring back at him seemed like a stranger. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about stock prices or reputation. He only cared about making things right. The lobby erupted with camera flashes as James stepped up to the podium. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. James raised his hand, and the room gradually fell silent. 10 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I built this company on one principle: profit above all else. I convinced myself that cutting corners was just good business." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." The reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notepads. Alfredo Sampson's death wasn't just a workplace accident. It was the result of our negligence, my negligence. We had received reports about safety concerns but chose to ignore them to meet deadlines. James's voice cracked slightly. "I buried the truth under paperwork and legal settlements thinking I could move on." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as James continued. "But then I met Elijah, Alfredo's son. This brilliant, resilient boy who waited every night in the park, reading his father's engineering book, still believing his dad would come home." James's eyes grew wet. "Through him, I saw the real cost of my actions. Not in dollars or legal settlements, but in a child growing up without his father." The room had grown completely still. Even the most hardened reporters seemed moved by the raw emotion in James's voice. "I can't bring Alfredo back. I can't undo the pain I've caused Elijah. But I can tell the truth, no matter the consequences." James gripped the podium tighter. "Starting today, I'm opening all our records for investigation. Every safety violation, every cover-up, all of it. I'm establishing a victims' compensation fund and implementing new safety protocols across all our sites." James took a deep breath. This company will change, not because it's good business, but because it's right. Because somewhere in this city, a boy taught me that integrity matters more than profit, that people matter more than power. The reporters erupted with questions, but James barely heard them. His thoughts were with Elijah, hoping that somewhere, maybe in that park, the boy would hear his words and understand that this time, he was choosing truth over everything else. The investigation team worked through mountains of documents late into the night at James's company headquarters. Papers rustled and computers hummed as they pieced together years of buried evidence. When the lead investigator finally looked up from his desk, his expression was grim but certain. "Mr. Prescott," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "These documents clearly show that former board members Thomas Wells and Marcus Reed deliberately ignored safety protocols, and orchestrated the cover-up of multiple incidents, including Mr. Sampson's death. James picked up the folder with trembling hands. Email threads, doctored inspection reports, and financial records painted a clear picture. His former board members had created a complex web of deception, all while letting him take the blame. "They knew," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They knew about the safety issues and hid them from me." Clara, who stood nearby, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The press will have this by morning. Your name will be cleared." But James barely heard her. Being proven innocent didn't lift the weight from his chest. All he could think about was Elijah, who still hadn't spoken to him in weeks. The boy's absence had left his large house feeling emptier than ever. The next day, James drove to the community center where Elijah now spent his afternoons. Through the window, he could see the boy working on an engineering project, his face serious and focused, just like his father's had been. James's heart ached at the sight. He walked in quietly, clutching the folder of evidence. Elijah looked up briefly, then back down at his work, his shoulders tensing. "Elijah," James said softly, "I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But there's something you need to see." He placed the folder on the table, careful not to disturb Elijah's project. The boy glanced at it reluctantly. "The investigation found out what really happened," James continued, his voice gentle. "Some bad people in my company hid the truth about your father's accident. They kept it from everyone, including me." Elijah's hand stopped moving over his project, but he didn't look up. "I made mistakes too," James admitted, fighting back tears. "I should have looked closer, should have asked more questions. Your father deserved better than that, and so did you." The boy's fingers traced the edge of the folder, but he still wouldn't meet James's eyes. The distance between them felt like an ocean, and James didn't know how to bridge it. "I miss you, Elijah," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I miss our engineering talks. I miss building things together. But I understand if you need more time." He turned to leave, his heart heavy. At the door, he heard a small voice behind him. "Did my dad's book help you figure it out?" James turned back. Elijah was finally looking at him, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and hope. "Your father's book? The one about engineering integrity," Elijah said. "He always said good engineers never cut corners." James felt tears spring to his eyes. "Your father was right, and he taught you well." In the weeks following the investigation, justice moved swiftly through the courts. The evidence against Thomas Wells and Marcus Reed was overwhelming, leaving no room for doubt about their culpability in the death of Alfredo Sampson and other safety violations. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing. James sat in the back row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as he watched his former board members receive their punishment. Wells and Reed were sentenced to 15 years each for criminal negligence and corporate fraud. As the judge read out the verdict, James glanced at Elijah, who sat beside him. The boy's face remained stoic, but his small hand gripped James's sleeve. It was the first physical contact they'd shared since the truth had come out. "Your father got his justice today," James said softly as they left the courthouse. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under their feet. Elijah nodded, his eyes fixed on the engineering book he always carried. "Dad would say it's not about getting even. It's about making things right." That evening, James and Elijah visited Alfredo's grave for the first time together. They placed fresh flowers beside the headstone, and Elijah carefully propped his father's book against it. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of trees in the wind. "I remember how he used to check every bolt twice," Elijah said, breaking the silence. "He said shortcuts weren't worth the risk." James felt the familiar ache of regret, but it was different now, less sharp, more like a dull reminder to do better. "Your father was a wise man, Elijah. He taught you well." In the following days, James noticed subtle changes in Elijah. The boy began leaving his engineering books around James's house again, started asking questions about structural design during dinner. Small steps, but significant ones. One Saturday morning, James found Elijah in the study, surrounded by drafting paper and mechanical pencils. He was working on a new bridge design, his face scrunched in concentration just like Alfredo's used to do. "Want some help?" James asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. Elijah looked up, considering the offer. After a moment, he slid some paper across the desk. "Dad always said 2 heads are better than 1. James sat down, picking up a pencil. As they worked together, the weight of grief seemed to lift slightly, making room for something new to grow in its place. It wasn't forgetting. It was healing, one careful calculation at a time. Later that day, Elijah shared stories about his father that he'd never told before. How Alfredo would sing off-key while making breakfast, his terrible jokes about load-bearing walls, the way he'd explain complex engineering concepts using kitchen utensils. Each memory was a gift, a piece of Alfredo that lived on through his son. James listened, understanding that this was part of their healing too, not just moving forward, but carrying the best parts of the past with them. The justice system had done its part, but the real healing happened in these quiet moments, in shared stories and silent understanding, in the gradual rebuilding of trust between a man and a boy who both carried the same loss in different ways. The evening sun cast long shadows through James's study windows as he sat across from Elijah. The boy was fiddling with a small model bridge they'd built together, his fingers tracing the careful joints and connections. James cleared his throat, his usual confident demeanor softening. "You know, Elijah, before I met you that night in the park, my life was all about numbers and profits." He paused, watching as Elijah's hands stilled on the model. "I thought success meant having the biggest buildings, the most impressive deals." Elijah looked up, his dark eyes meeting James's gaze. "But you changed everything," James continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You showed me what really matters, not the contracts or the money, but the people we care about, the lives we touch." James leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "I want you to know that you're not just here because I feel responsible for what happened. You're here because—" He took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Because you're family now. The family I never knew I needed." Elijah's lower lip trembled and tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to blink them away, but they spilled over anyway, rolling down his cheeks. He started, his voice cracking. "I missed you so much, James." The words came out in a rush, and suddenly Elijah was sobbing, his shoulders shaking. "Even when I was angry, I missed our talks and building things together," Elijah managed between sobs. "I missed having someone who understood about the engineering stuff like Dad did." James felt his own eyes growing wet as he watched this brave, brilliant boy finally let his guard down. The distance that had grown between them since the investigation seemed to dissolve in the space of those tears. "I missed you too, kiddo," James said softly. "More than you know." The following morning, James sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of adoption paperwork. His hands, usually steady when signing million-dollar contracts, trembled slightly as he filled out form after form. This wasn't just another business deal. This was about making Elijah officially his son. Clara knocked gently on the doorframe, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and more documents. "The family court representative called," she said with a warm smile. "They've expedited your case due to the special circumstances." "Thank you, Clara," James replied, taking the coffee. "How are people responding to everything?" "Actually, that's something else I wanted to show you." Clara pulled out her tablet and showed James several local news articles. The headlines read, "Local Businessman's Journey from Profit to Purpose," and "Community Rallies Behind Prescott's Adoption Bid." James scrolled through the comment section, his eyes widening at the outpouring of support. Parents from Elijah's school had organized a letter-writing campaign to the family court, vouching for the positive change they'd witnessed in both James and Elijah. The local engineering society, impressed by Elijah's competition entry and James's mentorship, had publicly endorsed the adoption. Even former critics of James's business practices were speaking up about his transparency during the investigation and his commitment to reform. "There's more," Clara said, pulling up another page. The parents of other kids in the engineering club started a social media campaign. "Look at this hashtag, Prescott Family." People are sharing stories about how you've changed the company's community involvement, the new safety standards you've implemented. James had to set down his coffee cup, overwhelmed by the support. Outside his office window, he could see Elijah in the garden, working on a new project with his engineering books spread around him on the grass. The community center called too, Clara added. They want to know if you and Elijah would consider starting a weekend engineering program for kids. They say lots of parents have been asking about it since the competition. James watched as Elijah sketched something in his notebook, his face scrunched in concentration, just like his father used to do. The sight made James's heart swell with pride and purpose. "You know," Clara said softly, "I've worked for you for 8 years, Mr. Prescott, and I've never seen you like this. The board members who resigned, they never understood that this change in you, and in the company, it's real. The community sees that." James nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The adoption papers in front of him represented more than just legal guardianship. They represented a second chance, for him, for Elijah, and for the legacy of Alfredo Sampson's dreams for his son. "The hearing is scheduled for next week," Clara reminded him gently. "The judge has already reviewed the community testimonials." James picked up his pen again, his hand now steady as he continued filling out the papers that would make official what his heart already knew, that Elijah was his son. James sat at his desk early one morning, reviewing a thick folder of incident reports from the past decade. Each page represented a family affected by his company's previous negligence. The weight of these stories pressed heavily on his conscience. "Clara," he called through the intercom, "could you come in, please?" Clara entered with her usual efficiency, notepad ready. But today was different. Instead of profit margins and construction schedules, they were discussing families. "I want to establish a compensation fund," James said, his voice firm but gentle. "Not just standard settlements, but real support. Education funds for children, medical coverage, job training programs, whatever these families need." Clara nodded, already making notes. "I've actually been compiling information on the affected families," she said, pulling out a separate folder. "Some have struggled to find work since the accident. Others have medical bills they're still paying off." James leaned forward, studying the detailed profiles Clara had prepared. "You've been working on this already?" "Ever since Elijah came into your life," she admitted. "I saw how it changed you, and I thought, well, there might be other families who need the same kind of support." Together, they developed a comprehensive support program. Clara reached out personally to each family, listening to their stories and needs. Some were initially skeptical, but Clara's genuine concern and James's commitment to making things right gradually won their trust. One afternoon, Clara organized a meeting where several families could share their experiences directly with James. In the company's conference room, now warmed by coffee and homemade cookies rather than corporate presentations, James listened intently to their stories. "My husband used to say this company cared more about buildings than people," one woman said, her voice trembling. "But what you're doing now, this is what caring looks like." Clara watched from the corner as James connected with each family, taking notes, asking questions, and most importantly, listening. She saw how he carried the same tenderness he showed Elijah into these interactions, treating each family's story with reverence and responsibility. The support program expanded beyond mere financial compensation. James and Clara established a network of resources, counseling services, job placement assistance, educational opportunities. They worked with local colleges to create scholarships for affected families' children. "You know," Clara said one evening as they reviewed the program's progress, "these families aren't just accepting help. They're becoming part of the solution. 3 of them have joined our safety advisory board." James nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "That's exactly what we need. People who understand firsthand why these changes matter." He paused, looking at Clara thoughtfully. "I couldn't do any of this without you, Clara. You've helped build bridges I thought were permanently burned." Clara straightened a stack of papers, hiding her emotion behind professional efficiency. "These families deserved better before," she said simply. "We're just making sure they get it now." The autumn breeze rustled through the cemetery's maple trees, scattering golden leaves across the peaceful grounds. James and Elijah walked hand in hand along the winding path, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Elijah clutched his father's old engineering book in his other hand, its worn edges familiar and comforting against his palm. They stopped at Alfredo Sampson's grave, where a simple headstone stood among the scattered leaves. James stepped back slightly, giving Elijah some space while remaining close enough to offer support. Elijah knelt down and placed the lilies carefully against the stone. His small fingers traced the engraved letters of his father's name. "Hi, Dad," he said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. "I brought your favorite book with me today." James watched as Elijah opened the engineering book to a dog-eared page, showing it to the headstone as if his father could see it. "Remember this chapter about bridge construction? I understand it all now. James has been teaching me, and guess what? I got an A+ on my science project last week." Tears glimmered in Elijah's eyes, but his smile remained bright. "I'm doing really well in school, Dad. My teachers say I might be able to skip a grade if I keep it up." He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "James helps me with my homework every night, just like you used to do." James felt his own eyes growing misty as he listened to Elijah's gentle conversation with his father. "You don't have to worry about me anymore, Dad," Elijah continued, running his hand over the smooth stone. "James takes really good care of me. He makes sure I eat my vegetables even though I still don't like broccoli." He let out a small laugh. "And he never lets me stay up too late reading, just like you." The boy placed his father's book carefully beside the flowers. "I'm keeping your book safe, and I'm learning everything in it. James says I might be an even better engineer than both of you someday." A gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling Elijah's hair. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if feeling his father's presence in the wind. "I miss you so much, Dad," he whispered, "but I want you to know I'm okay. James is taking care of everything." They both knelt in silence for a few moments, offering their prayers for peace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grave, and the autumn air carried the sweet scent of fallen leaves. In this quiet moment, surrounded by nature's gentle embrace, father and son found their connection, bridged by the man who had opened his heart to make their family whole. Months became years. The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Prescott Construction's headquarters. Elijah Prescott Sampson, now 23 and fresh from graduating with honors in engineering, straightened his tie as he walked through the familiar hallways. Though he'd visited these offices countless times over the years, today felt different. Today was his first official day as a junior engineer. Employees smiled warmly as he passed, many having watched him grow up under James's care. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor as he made his way to his father's office, where James waited to begin their first day working together professionally. James stood by his desk, pride evident in his eyes as he watched Elijah enter. The years had added touches of gray to James's temples, but his presence remained as commanding as ever. "Ready for your first day?" he asked, his voice warm with affection. "More than ready," Elijah replied, returning the smile. He placed his leather briefcase, a graduation gift from James, on the conference table. "I've been preparing for this my whole life." James walked over and straightened Elijah's already perfect tie, a familiar gesture from their morning routines over the years. "Your father would be so proud of you," he said softly. "Both of your fathers are." Elijah's eyes grew misty as he pulled out the old engineering book, his biological father's book, that had started everything. Its pages were more worn now, but it remained his most treasured possession. He opened it to a particular page about structural integrity, the same concepts he'd later studied in college. "Remember when we used to study this together?" Elijah asked, touching the yellowed pages gently. "You'd explain everything so patiently, even when I asked a million questions." James chuckled, remembering those evening study sessions at their dining room table. "And now look at you, graduating top of your class, ready to revolutionize our safety protocols with your fresh ideas." They moved to the blueprints spread across James's desk, where their first project together awaited. It was a community center being built in the same park where they'd first met, a fitting symbol of their journey together. As they discussed the plans, their dynamic shifted seamlessly between father and son to mentor and protege, their shared passion for engineering evident in every exchange. "I was thinking," Elijah said, pointing to a section of the blueprint, "we could implement those enhanced safety features we discussed during my final year project. It would make the structure not just safer, but more sustainable too." James nodded approvingly, watching as Elijah confidently explained his innovations. The scared little boy reading under a park bench had grown into a capable young man, carrying forward not just his biological father's dreams, but also the values and knowledge James had instilled in him. "You know," James said, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder, "having you here working alongside me, it's everything I hoped for when I first took you in. You've become more than I could have ever imagined." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of both his father's legacies in the best possible way. Here he was, in the company his adoptive father had transformed, ready to make his own mark while honoring the memory of the father who had first inspired his love of engineering. The weeks flew by as Elijah settled into his role at Prescott Construction. His fresh perspective and innovative ideas brought new energy to every project meeting. The young engineer had inherited James's sharp eye for detail, but combined it with his own natural creativity and deep understanding of safety protocols. During one particular project review, Elijah presented his modifications to a residential complex design. The conference room was packed with senior engineers and project managers, all listening intently as he explained his vision. By reinforcing these support structures, Elijah pointed to the 3D model displayed on the screen, "we can increase stability while actually reducing material costs." His confidence showed in every gesture, every explanation backed by thorough research. James sat at the back of the room, watching with quiet pride as his son commanded the attention of veterans in the field. The other employees nodded appreciatively, some taking detailed notes. Clara, who had watched Elijah grow up in these halls, smiled knowingly at James. "What impresses me most," said Peterson, the head of structural engineering, "is how you've integrated the safety features so seamlessly into the design. It's innovative yet practical." After the meeting, the hallways buzzed with positive discussions about Elijah's proposals. Senior engineers who had initially been skeptical of the young graduate now sought his input on their own projects. His humble approach and willingness to learn from others' experience earned him respect throughout the company. James and Elijah often worked late into the evening, poring over blueprints together in James's office. Their discussions would flow naturally between technical details and personal conversations, their relationship deepening through their shared passion. "You've got a real gift for this," James remarked one evening, watching Elijah refine a design on his tablet. "The way you consider both the technical and human aspects of each project, it's exactly what this company needs." The employees noticed how Elijah's presence had softened James as well. The once intimidating CEO now smiled more often, took time to mentor younger staff members, and always made sure to acknowledge good work. The father-son duo had created a more collaborative and innovative atmosphere throughout the company. During team meetings, other engineers began prefacing their presentations with "building on Elijah's safety concepts" or "incorporating Prescott Sampson's efficiency model." His ideas had become an integral part of the company's new standard practices. One particular morning, Elijah arrived at his office to find several project managers waiting to discuss implementing his safety protocols across all ongoing constructions. His methods had proven so effective that they were becoming company policy, a testament to how far he'd come from that little boy reading engineering books under a park bench. Through it all, James and Elijah maintained their close bond, each growing stronger through their shared work and mutual support. Their relationship had evolved into a perfect balance of professional collaboration and father-son affection, creating a model of leadership that inspired everyone around them. The city fair was just days away, and the Prescott construction office buzzed with activity. In the main conference room, James and Elijah stood before their bridge model, a masterpiece of modern engineering that incorporated all the safety features they'd developed together over the years. "Your father would have loved this," James said softly, watching Elijah make final adjustments to the scale model. The bridge design was revolutionary, not just in its technical aspects, but in how it prioritized worker safety at every stage of construction. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he connected the last piece. I keep thinking about how he used to explain bridge mechanics to me when I was little. He smiled, remembering those precious moments. He'd use pencils and paper clips to show me how suspension bridges worked. The model before them was far more sophisticated than paper clips and pencils. It featured cutting-edge materials and innovative safety systems, all displayed in perfect miniature. Small LED lights illuminated the structure, highlighting the key safety features they'd integrated into the design. James noticed Elijah's nervous energy as he double-checked every detail. You know, presenting at the city fair isn't just about showcasing the bridge. James placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. It's about honoring your father's memory by making construction sites safer for everyone. The fair would attract thousands of visitors, including industry leaders and city officials. Their presentation would be the centerpiece of the engineering pavilion, demonstrating how innovation and safety could work hand in hand. As they carefully packed the model for transport, Clara entered with a stack of presentation materials. "The banners just arrived," she announced, unrolling a large poster that read, "The Alfredo Sampson Memorial Bridge, Building a Safer Future." Elijah's eyes welled up at the sight of his father's name. James felt his own throat tighten with emotion. The bridge wasn't just a project anymore. It was a testament to how tragedy could spark positive change, how loss could lead to legacy. That evening, as they finished preparations in James's home office, Elijah pulled out an old, worn engineering book, the same one he used to read under the park bench. "Dad always said that great engineering comes from the heart as much as the mind," he mused, running his fingers over the familiar pages. James nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. The fair would be more than a professional milestone. It would be a public tribute to the man whose death had brought them together, whose memory had inspired them to revolutionize construction safety standards. As they reviewed their presentation one last time, both father and son felt the mixture of excitement and reverence that came with honoring Alfredo's memory in such a meaningful way. The bridge model stood between them, a symbol of their journey together and the legacy they were building. The morning of the city fair dawned bright and clear. A steady stream of people flowed through the entrance gates, their excited chatter filling the air. The engineering pavilion, adorned with banners and displays, stood at the heart of the fairgrounds. James stood near their presentation booth, watching Elijah methodically arrange their materials. The young man moved with purpose, placing informational packets just so and ensuring the lighting hit their bridge model perfectly. His confidence showed in every precise movement, every careful adjustment. Camera crews from local news stations set up their equipment nearby, while city council members and construction industry leaders gathered in small groups, their attention drawn to the impressive display. The banner bearing Alfredo's name caught the morning light, drawing more than a few curious glances. "The turnout is incredible," Clara whispered to James, clipboard in hand as she managed the growing crowd of interested observers. James barely heard her, too absorbed in watching Elijah work. Pride swelled in his chest as his son, yes, his son, handled each interaction with professional grace. Elijah greeted visitors with warm handshakes and articulate explanations of their safety innovations. His eyes lit up when describing the technical aspects of the bridge, just as they had years ago when he first shared his engineering knowledge under that park bench. But now, instead of a lonely boy with a worn book, he stood as a confident young engineer, commanding respect from industry veterans. James noticed how Elijah's hands, once small enough to barely hold that old engineering book, now moved with authority as he pointed out the model's features. The same determination that had kept him studying alone in the park now powered his passionate explanations to attentive listeners. Community leaders nodded approvingly as Elijah detailed the safety measures incorporated into the design. Several construction workers, still in their work clothes, listened intently, their faces showing appreciation for the thoughtful safety considerations. A warm feeling spread through James's chest as he observed from a slight distance. This wasn't just about presenting a bridge model. It was watching Elijah come into his own, seeing the culmination of their journey together. The scared, lonely boy had grown into a capable young man who carried his father's legacy forward while forging his own path. More people gathered around their booth, drawn by Elijah's engaging presence and the impressive display. James caught fragments of impressed conversations. Remarkable young man. Innovative design. Setting new standards. Each comment reinforced what James already knew. Elijah had found his calling, and this was just the beginning. The media's cameras focused on Elijah as he demonstrated the bridge's safety features, his natural confidence shining through. James felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that their shared work would help protect future workers and honor Alfredo's memory in the most meaningful way possible. Clara touched James's arm gently. "You did this," she said softly. "You gave him the chance to become who he was meant to be." James shook his head, his eyes never leaving Elijah. "No," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He did this. I just helped him find his way." Elijah stepped up to the podium, his heart beating steadily as he faced the gathered crowd. The bridge model stood proudly beside him, its sleek design catching the morning light. He took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the small photograph of his father that he'd tucked into his jacket pocket for courage. "This bridge," he began, his voice clear and strong, "represents more than just innovative engineering. It's a testament to two men who shaped my life, my father, Alfredo Sampson, and James Prescott, the man who became my second father." The audience fell silent, drawn in by the personal nature of his words. James, standing at the back of the crowd, felt his throat tighten with emotion. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "When I lost him, I thought those dreams died too. But then I met James." Elijah's eyes found James in the crowd, and a warm smile spread across his face. "He found me reading my father's old engineering book in the park, and instead of just walking by, he stopped. He listened. He cared." The crowd listened intently as Elijah explained the safety features they'd incorporated into the design, his passion evident in every word. "This bridge combines my father's vision of engineering as a way to help people with James's commitment to worker safety. Every innovation, every safety measure, is designed to protect families like mine. My father always said that great engineering isn't just about building structures. It's about building better lives," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger. "Through James's guidance, I've learned that he was right. This bridge design isn't just our project, it's our promise to every construction worker and their families." As Elijah concluded his presentation, the audience rose to their feet, applause thundering through the pavilion. James felt tears welling in his eyes, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude. The lonely boy from the park had become not just an accomplished engineer, but a compassionate young man who understood the true purpose of their work. The applause continued as Elijah stood there, humble yet proud, his father's spirit and James's influence evident in his bearing. In that moment, James saw their journey reflected in the bridge model, a path from loss to connection, from solitude to family, from broken trust to unshakable bonds. James watched as Elijah graciously accepted congratulations from the crowd, his heart swelling with a pride he'd never known in all his years of business success. Standing there in his perfectly tailored suit, he realized how different he was from the man who had walked through that park years ago. Tears welled in James's eyes as he remembered Elijah's innocent face, waiting for a father who would never return. The guilt that had first driven him to help had transformed into something pure and precious, genuine love for the boy who had become his son. "Look how far we've come," he whispered to himself, watching Elijah explain a technical detail to an interested investor. Gone was the hardened businessman who saw people as assets and liabilities. In his place stood a father who measured success not in dollars, but in the brightness of his son's smile. The proudest moment wasn't when their bridge design won awards or when the company's reputation was restored. It was the day Elijah had first called him Dad, not as a replacement for Alfredo, but as an acknowledgement of the bond they'd built together. That single word had meant more than all the millions in his bank account. As he watched Elijah now, confident and compassionate, James felt a deep sense of peace. His own transformation from a cold-hearted businessman to a caring father hadn't been easy, but it had been the most rewarding journey of his life. The ruthless ambition that once drove him had been replaced by something far more meaningful: the simple joy of seeing his son thrive. Every smile, every achievement, every moment of Elijah's happiness was worth more than any business success he'd ever achieved. In helping Elijah heal and grow, James had found his own healing, his own growth, his own true measure of success. That evening, James and Elijah sat at their favorite Italian restaurant, the same one where they'd celebrated Elijah's first engineering competition victory years ago. The warm glow of pendant lights cast a gentle shimmer across their table, and the familiar scent of garlic and fresh herbs filled the air. "Remember when I couldn't even pronounce a spaghetti carbonara properly?" Elijah chuckled, twirling pasta around his fork with practiced ease. His eyes sparkled with mischief as he recalled his younger self struggling with the menu. James laughed, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine joy. "And now look at you, ordering in perfect Italian." He reached for his water glass, his hand pausing mid-air as memories washed over him. "Sometimes I still can't believe how far we've come." Elijah set down his fork, his expression growing serious yet tender. "You know, Dad," he began, the words still making James's heart skip a beat. "I never properly thanked you for everything." "You don't have to," James started, but Elijah gently raised his hand. "I do," he insisted softly. "That night in the park I was so lost and alone, but you didn't just give me a home, you gave me a future, a purpose." His voice trembled slightly as he continued. "You could have walked past that bench like everyone else did, but you stopped. You cared." James felt the familiar sting of tears in his eyes as Elijah spoke. The bustling restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in this precious moment. "My father taught me about engineering," Elijah continued, his voice full of emotion. "But you taught me about life, about resilience, about turning pain into purpose." He smiled through his own tears. "You gave me a new life, Dad, and I'm grateful for every single day of it." They both laughed as they wiped their eyes, drawing knowing smiles from the waiters who had served them for years. The sound of their laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversation around them, creating a perfect harmony of happiness and gratitude. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah and James, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.